continue to build on and keep the discipline moving.
Keep the conversation going.
Yeah. And note that history changes.
Yes. And do you think this new focus on historiography is really healthy? It's a really good thing to be encouraging more debate in that way?
Absolutely. I think that it is really what exactly should be being taught to young people is historiography. How do we talk about history? How do we judge the past? Why thinking critically is so important? What is that, why is Piers Morgan so critical of Meghan Markle? What is his, what is his bias there? Let's see, if we just read his account, so we're going to think that she's this awful woman or whatever, but then let's read this and let's see what are these differences of opinion. The way we read the papers today is a way that we can look at sources to the past. Certain biases of one left-leaning paper will differ compared to a right-leaning paper. It's a very similar way to how we can interrogate certain things like chroniclers.
And we were talking earlier about reading against the grain. Can you just explain a little bit about what that means, that concept?
Yeah, so Natalie Zeman-Davis writes about this more eloquently than I would probably explain it now, but reading against the grain is particularly when you're faced with a source in front of you that is largely, say, for example, you're looking at court record. Instead of sort of taking verbatim what is written, it's about looking at it from the perspective of the people who it is being written about, trying to add different arguments to what the material is giving you that is in front of you. So for example, if there is a woman who is in a court setting and she is being charged of misdemeanors, misbehaviours, adultery, something like that, looking at the charges that are placed against her and instead of taking those as fact, kind of reading against them and criticising them. So criticising the source, trying to make it work harder. I think that is, when people ask me how do you fill in gaps in the archive, it's about trying to make sources that you have available work a lot harder by asking lots of questions of it.
Okay, great. The second book you've written, your very first book, The Red Prince, John of Gaunt. For the audience, I don't know how many people have actually know much, but would you mind just telling us a little bit about who John of Gaunt was, where he came from, and why he featured as your first choice of book?
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I'm sort of talking about how, all these privileged histories, and it's like I go and write a book about a white, very rich magnate in the 14th century. So John of Gaunt was always fascinating to me. He is the third son of Edward III, but it was through John of Gaunt that we have what is effectively the monarchical legacy that we know and love, the Tudors, today. And if it weren't for him, none of that would have existed. So the claim to the throne through Henry Tudor was through Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt. And it's not just that. It was that makes him interesting, really. That doesn't make him interesting at all. It's just coincidence. But it was, as a character and a figure, he's fascinating to me because he lived at a time where he bridged the first half of the 14th century, which was so focused on war and chivalry and this idea of knighthood and chivalric glory, jousts, tournaments. It was all very kind of, elaborate and sumptuous. And then you have the Black Death as well. And then he also lived through Richard II's reign, which was very, very different. And the politics completely changed. So much happened within his lifetime that he was directly or indirectly associated with the Peasants Revolt, Geoffrey Chaucer, that he sort of seems to be one of those people. I do describe it at the beginning of the book, like this part of history being like a play, like on the stage, and he's always in the wings. He's always sort of somewhat present for these events. And so I wanted to look at this period and tell it really through the life of this magnate that people don't really seem to know a lot about, but everyone's heard of for some reason, because he's sort of got his fingers in so many pies. And what I found so fascinating about John of Gaunt is how European he was and how his mindset was so focused on expansion and a Plantagenet empire in a way that that we really don't think of for the 14th century, particularly in the reign of Richard II.
And he had ambitions to be a king himself, didn't he? For very kind of, for his ambition seems to have driven him throughout for many decades, this almost obsession with Castile and Leon and having the crown.
Yeah.
And it almost determines English politics, doesn't it? And the way in which, how do you think that do you think you've rehabilitated his image? Because has there been some sort of improvement in how we see John of Gaunt now?
I think so. And I think I surprise people because I think John of Gaunt has always been sort of associated with a little bit of a Richard III type character in that he wanted the throne, he was the bad uncle, he wanted to unseat his sort of child king nephew. And all of this, to me, when I was researching him, became clearly not true. His obsession was to continue the legacy of his Plantagenet forebears and his father and his brother, the Black Prince. He wanted to, as I said a moment ago, create a sort of Plantagenet empire. He wanted to expand into Europe, create these incredibly strong territorial dynastic links with Europe. He wanted to become King of Castile, which was an incredibly important superpower within medieval politics. Castile was one of the kingdoms that now make up Spain. It's the biggest one. And
he fought there, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He fought there. Yeah, he did.
His
one of the only battles of the 100 Years' War. Yeah, yeah, he did.
And do you find that he seems to feature very heavily in the story of the Peasants' Revolt, and yet he wasn't in the country?
No.
Do you find that his story arc, if you like, and his involvement in that, was it for him? Do you think it was a period where he had to really reassess everything? We talked about him being at his most indecisive in that year. Do you feel that this really did for him?
Yeah, I do. I think for me, I actually almost, as I mentioned to you earlier, I almost begun the book with the Peasants' Revolt because for me, 1381 was the sort of crux in John of Gaunt's life. I think everything changed. So prior to the 1381, he was the most powerful man in the country. He was effectively regent. Richard was still very much in his minority. He had grown up in a period of this pro-war propaganda. His father was a very popular king for most of his reign. He had this objective of war and chivalry and martial glory, and that was something that was very much counteracted later on by his nephew. But he was sort of at this point, leading up to the Peasants' Revolt, pretty much doing what he kind of wanted to do. He was the most powerful man in the realm. He had so much money. He was sort of swanning around with his mistress, just calling himself King of Castile, having his Palace of the Savoy, which effectively was his own kingdom. It was all a bit weird, not something that Londoners in particular were used to at all. You had two kings in one city. That's just strange. But then what became clear to me in the research was that 1381 was cataclysmic for him. He was suddenly totally stripped of all of this power because he did not know where he stood, and he was so vulnerable. He was literally reduced to a very small guard, and that was it. And he had to retreat to within Scotland during the revolt. He tried to move south to his property at Pontefract to find out what was going on and, get his men to rally around him and the king and support the king. He was actually forced back to Scotland because there was uncertainty as to whether he was going to be captured and killed. So this is somebody who was toppled, the greatest man in the realm, toppled by this revolt.
And do you feel that there's slight suggestion that Richard kept him waiting, didn't send messages back to him, telling him it's all right to come back to London? He was kept very much in the dark, wasn't he?
I mean, I imagine a lot of you teach 14-year-olds. And can you imagine putting the hands into a very sort of entitled 14-year-old, and you've got this uncle that's been irritating them for all of this time? They're like, I'm just going to make you squirm because I can. That's the sort of relationship that John of Gaunt had with Richard at this point. He wanted to make his uncle squirm. He wanted to show him who actually was in charge. And that's very much how I read it. It's this slight petulant teenager, authority figure balance. And that was kind of what was going on there.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask was just how serious was the rising of 1381 in a general way? How serious do you think it was for our country?
I think it was very serious, and I think that it could have gone. I think if they had if they had not disbanded after the death of Wat Tyler, I think that it could have been quite groundbreaking, actually. It could have changed the course of history quite significantly. But because of that, because they lost their leader, because they believed in divine providence, they believed that the king was indeed meant to be king. They were really just after his bad advisors, and they'd already got rid of a couple of them. They didn't continue the cause. And they also believed that Richard was going to liberate them. They believed that he would be true to his word, and he would give them everything that they had required, they had requested, and to remove the tax, liberate the people. And he didn't do that. So they were foolish because they believed him. But I think it could have changed. I do think it could have significantly changed. But what I think is most important about the Peasants' Revolt, really, is that it has been, for posterity called a pitchfork rebellion, which I think is deeply unfair, because it wasn't a pitchfork rebellion. This wasn't the peasants revolting. I think it's a terrible name for it, because it was actually so many different people, merchants, people who were wealthy, clerics. There was a real combination of all sorts of people from different walks of life, professional people who were just rising up against this totally unfair oppression and crippling tax for a war that they had no real interest in.
So one of the things I wanted to look at, do you think that John of Gaunt was in fact the victim of his own ambition, or do you think at every stage he was undermined by the idea of living in his brother's sort of shadow, or his father even?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's probably a combination of the two. I think that he was deeply ambitious to try and claim a kingdom of Castile, a country that he'd been to once, and he didn't really understand the terrain. He didn't understand, the people. I think that was highly ambitious. But I also think that he was hamstrung because of his loyalty. He was incredibly loyal to his father and his brother and their vision, and that was really the kind of undoing of him. He only really got into trouble with the church and with the people when he was trying to defend royal authority. He didn't like these merchant classes who had lots of money, who were effectively giving big loans to the king. He didn't really like the power that they had within court because of that. He believed in this sort of pure monarchy type setup.
I was going to give the opportunity, I don't know how we're doing on time, about 10 minutes left, and this is a really good opportunity now for opening it up to the floor and asking any audience questions. And I don't know how we're going to do this without any feed or... fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask Helen, please don't hesitate to ask. This is your opportunity. Would anyone like to begin? Tom, you're on. This is get Tom running around all over the place.
Hi, can you tell us more about your next book? Because
yes.
I know that is forthcoming soon.
Well, it depends what you mean by soon. So I've literally just started it because I got the deal just before I had my son 8 months ago, and I've just had maternity leave, and now I'm working on it. So my next book is going to be called This England, and it's a new history of the 14th century, and it's there are different things that are going to be within it. It's going to talk about how the 14th century was a period where we sort of shaped our sense of national identity and patriotism, but also that it's always been described as a calamitous century with the Black Death, etc., which is going to be very much covered. But I'm also arguing it wasn't just calamitous, it was actually quite revolutionary, and there's a series of revolutions within the century that have, that sort of paved the way we see ourselves as a nation moving into the early modern period. And it's going to be told from the perspective of the last Plantagenets as well, because you have this dynasty that really ends with the death of Richard II in 1399. So yeah, that's what it's going to be about.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Just put your hand up if you've got a question. Please don't hesitate. Oh, here we go. Sarah.
Hello, sorry, I lost my voice at Parents' Evening on Thursday. I don't sound like this normally. So myself and Andrew as well, we're particularly interested in local history.
Okay.
And there's some historians that have said that it's sort of more like educationally relevant than any other type of history. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Educationally relevant in regard to teaching? Or...
I can't remember which historian, it might have been John Tosh that said it, but just, I guess, on local history generally and the value of it.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily more relevant, but I think that these micro-histories, I think, are important, and I think that they would be a good way to sort of ground yourself in the sources and interrogating the past by sort of interrogating it within a sort of in a sort of micro level rather than a macro one. And then I suppose you could apply then the questions that you might ask the archive on a micro level with your local histories to the sort of macro. And how, local histories fit within that larger, I suppose, national history. But I do think studying local history is really important. And I think something that is great about local histories, especially, in regard to a teaching capacity, would be people, because they are still existing within the landscape, and young people are still existing and living within the landscape that they're studying. What is really interesting for them is probably to be able to actually visually acknowledge how that has changed, and so being able to mentally apply what they are reading or researching about the past onto what they see before them within the present, within their sort of circle. And whether that's applying that to young people or just oneself as a historian, I think that is really interesting. I mean, I've never been personally one to study local histories, but I can absolutely see the benefit in doing so. Even things like the history of the home, like history of your house, like tracing back, who lived in your house through generations, what their lives were like, what their jobs were like. I think that's just as a project, that's such a great way to get into the past and get into studying history.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, Philippa.
What's your ultimate goal as a historian? What's your ultimate goal as a historian?